I think we're going to go ahead and get started, but keep introducing yourselves as we're heading through the beginning of this webinar today. So as I said, my name is Jasmine Rangel. I'm a Senior Associate of PolicyLink. I'm joined today by my colleagues who co-authored this new guide that we're going to be presenting to you all today, but I'd love to give it to them to introduce themselves too, starting with Trom Huang.
Hi everyone, my name is Trom Huang. I'm a Senior Associate at PolicyLink. Super excited to be here today to share this new resource with you all and appreciate you tuning in. I use she, her pronouns. I'm based in Minneapolis, and I'll pass it to Amanda.
Hey everyone, Amanda Insulaco, Legal Research Specialist with the National Coalition for a Civil Right to Counsel. I'm really excited you could join us today. I use they, them pronouns.
Amazing. Thank you so much, both. Can we go to the next slide, please? And then the next one after this. Thank you so much. So today we're going to cover a lot of ground. The first of which we're going to just do some context and some framing for our conversation that's going to happen later on within the hour. Talk about the state of the renter, existing ballot initiative campaigns that have happened in the last 2 years, and also maybe looking into the future. What's the current moment that we're working in right now? We're also going to be giving you a sneak preview of the guide, which you will receive a link to during this webinar so that you can dig deeper into it as well. But then we'll also be hearing from organizers from Portland and from the ERA campaign in Multnomah County, Multnomah County, Oregon, to hear how either the guide's been useful to them or how all of the content within the guide can be useful for other housing justice advocates across the country looking to potentially support a ballot initiative campaign in the next 3 years. Then we're going to be going into Q&A. Please, throughout the webinar, if you have any questions that come up, feel free to put them in the chat and we will try our best to get to them, if not during the webinar, at least afterwards. So I'm going to start us out by talking a little bit about the state of the renter right now. Thank you so much. So the state of the renter, as we all might know, in 2023 is tumultuous to say the least. Across the country, half of renters experience housing cost burdens, meaning that they're spending more than 30% of their monthly income on housing costs. Compared to homeowners, renters are 28 percentage points more likely to experience housing cost burdens, and as a result, experience a greater precarity when it comes to the risk of being evicted. Housing cost burdens also, because they exist for a lot of families, they force them to choose where they're investing their limited resources. So are they going to pay rent, or are they going to pay less on groceries, on their healthcare, on their transportation costs, on their education costs, you name it. Very difficult decisions are being made every month. Next slide, please. But the reality of affording a safe and stable place to live is vastly different among various groups of people. Historic and present day discriminatory and exclusionary housing and economic policies create harsher conditions for marginalized groups of people, especially Black and Latinx women, who are disproportionately facing challenges paying rent every month. Specifically, as you can see here, 60% of Black women are housing cost burdened, and 59% of Latinx women are cost burdened. A trend that also helps explain the disproportionate rates of eviction amongst Black and Latinx women, and who are filed against at higher rates compared to their male and white counterparts. Next slide, please. More and more people, and especially tenants, are continuing to feel the brunt of the pandemic's economic after effects through slow wage growth, inflation, and rent hikes. In fact, as figure 1 here shows, the median rent for a newly leased unit has increased 32%, while figure 2 shows us how incomes have continued to stagnate in relation to those rents. These conditions have continued to create the environment in which people who experience housing cost burdens are making really hard decisions every week, like I mentioned before, to decide where their limited funds are going to go. Next slide, please. And in fact, these increasing financial pressures match up with what we've seen at PolicyLink and in our latest attitudinal survey findings, which clearly show how much of a top priority concern affordable housing is for people across the country. And people are continuously and even more they're growing their understanding that housing is a basic human need. And even more people are starting to understand that housing is a human right. Next slide, please. And these concerns with affordable housing also match up the way that people have voted in the last 2 years. The financial and rental pressures have motivated people to advance the solutions that they know will work in their communities. And they've been putting housing justice policies on the ballot, such as rent stabilization, just cause eviction protections, and a right to counsel, just to name a few. The results of these wins across the country and in just the last few years have paved the way for millions of renters to receive the benefits of additional protections. And even more campaigns are starting to pop up across the country in states like Oregon, Ohio, and in Maryland. And we're looking forward to even more ballot initiatives taking off on the ground to build power and advance equity in our communities. Here we can see just a few of the most notable housing justice wins in the movement that we've seen in the last year. But I'd love to pass it on to Trom to give us a little bit more of an insight on what are the strongest policy design elements for that communities can pursue across the country.
Thanks, Jasmine. Perfect. Thanks for moving that slide. All right. So in our ballot initiative guide, we feature case studies of campaigns that have placed both rent stabilization and right to counsel policies on the ballot. And as many of you already know, rent stabilization policies create a predictable schedule for maximum annual rent increases while also ensuring a fair return for property owners. There are many benefits to rent stabilization, including the ability to immediately stabilize prices, end predatory rent gouging, and reduce the risk of displacement and homelessness. And it also increases long-term housing stability, which has its own long list of positive impacts on households and communities. And as some of you know, there are over 180 jurisdictions, so cities, states, counties, with some form of rent stabilization in place, and none of them are identical. So here's some really important key principles that should be followed to create the strongest rent stabilization policy possible. Just having rent stabilization is not enough, right? You want to make sure that you have a strong policy that closes loopholes, that actually ensures long-term housing stability and affordability for renters. And so if you're in a place that's considering rent stabilization, take note of these 4 goals or these principles for effective policy. The first is maximizing coverage of rental homes. And that means reducing the number of exemptions in your policy. Some places exempt single-family homes, new construction, they even exempt affordable housing, which makes very little sense to me because affordable housing and the folks who live in affordable housing are the ones that need tenant protections the most, right? And when we have these exemptions, they can really add up. And so, this patchwork of, exempting single family homes here and new construction there and affordable housing here, these exemptions really add up and they create a dual housing market where some renters are protected and some are at the whim of the private market. And that's a dangerous dynamic to have. So ensure that you're maximizing coverage by minimizing exemptions. The second piece is pairing rent stabilization with robust tenant protections. A really good example of that is having just cause protections. So just cause can protect tenants from no cause evictions, and then rent stabilization protects tenants from economic evictions. And together they create a fuller safety net in terms of evictions for tenants. The third one is maximizing maximizing long-term affordability, which means being really careful about the formula that you choose for the annual rent increase. For example, prior to the pandemic, many cities and states had annual rent increases that were based on inflation, or as you've all kind of seen in these formulas, CPI. And then we entered into this period of historically high inflation rates, right? Inflation of 7%, 6-7%. And when that happened, these cities found that CPI alone did not work. For example, we had states with formulas like CPI plus 7%. And what that meant is that maximum annual rent increases were set at 14%, which for many tenants is untenable, right? And so thankfully, we have seen some shifts to formulas. So during this time of high inflation, we've seen some shifts. Cities have come back to their city councils or to their legislators and are trying to change the formulas to add additional protection. So now we see formulas like 60% of CPI or 3%, whichever is lower, or CPI with a maximum of 5%. So this is just a way to anticipate times of high inflation. So make sure that the formula you choose works across tumultuous economic times. And then lastly, tenants should play a central role in program design and implementation. Because enforcement of rent stabilization, and to be honest, many tenant protections is not always done robustly by local governments. Tenants are often enforcing their own rights to tenant protections. And so making sure that their experiences are centered when planning out how the law will be operationalized is one way to ensure that it will actually be implementable and will be leveraged by tenants in their day-to-day. I'm going to add 2 reports in the chat that provide some great data on rent stabilization policies and their impacts, and then I'll pass it to Amanda to talk about tenant right to counsel.
Yeah, thanks, Trom. Okay, so when we talk about the right to counsel for tenants, what are we talking about? What are the key components and things to consider? So this may seem obvious, but we're really talking about something enacted in the law that says tenants facing eviction or eviction-like procedures get an attorney. So, and what we're getting at here is really not just additional funding for legal aid. Right, because that's kind of the status quo. That's where we're at now. It's not a bad thing, but it's not a right to counsel. We're also looking for a policy that's publicly funded, and this is about sustainability. It's about accountability. It sends a really powerful message, we think, to communities that the government is taking a step in the right direction to try to rectify past harms and policies that have resulted in certain communities being disproportionately impacted by eviction. And it's our position that, if private foundation money, grants are needed just to get the program off the ground, that's okay. But really, ultimately, the program, the responsibility should be on the government to fund it. We also want to ensure an attorney for all tenants, and there may be an eligibility requirement that's certainly common. Eligibility is often tied to income, like 80% of AMI or 200% of the federal poverty level. But increasingly, there's a really exciting push for universal representation. And we'll get to hear later on from Colleen with eviction representation for all, where in Multnomah County, they've pushed for a universal right. And in fact, 4 of the 18 jurisdictions that have enacted a right to counsel to date have a universal right that's not tied to income. Okay, so last we have the right to full representation. And this means that we're moving away from a resource scarcity model where legal services organizations are deciding what level of service to provide, based on their capacity. So full representation, in contrast to that, is really the attorney doing whatever is required in that specific case to achieve the best outcome they can for the tenant. Okay, next slide, please.
All right, thanks, Amanda. Next, we're really excited to officially debut our latest resource, which is the Ballot Initiative Guide itself. The link to download the report will be in the chat, and I encourage you all to download it and share it with your networks. This guide is for tenant organizers, housing advocates, legal advocates, and anyone interested in running a ballot initiative campaign. So whether you're in the early stages of dreaming up a campaign or already have a policy and team built, this guide is meant to support campaigns from start to finish and even beyond Election Day. We'll be going over the various sections of the guide in detail. So the sections that we have, for example, are ballot initiatives as effective pathways to housing justice, which is a really helpful legal analysis of how to get to the ballot. Campaign strategy, so running an initiative campaign, what it takes, how you put the team together, the strategies you use, running the actual campaign. We have a section on housing justice narrative, so understanding that such a big part of running campaigns is having a strong narrative around the policy and the values that you're uplifting. We also have a section on the hangover. So what happens after post-election day, whether you win or lose, there's a lot of work to be done. And then lastly, we have a section on the future movement. And before we go over the guide in detail, I just want to name our gratitude for the many campaigns that we've spoken to, many of whom are in the audience today or our guest speakers. So a lot of gratitude to each of you for sharing your experiences and wisdom with us. Their campaigns and wins made this guide possible, and we're very excited for their stories to inspire campaigns across the country. And so with that, I'm going to pass it back to Amanda to talk about the first section of the guide.
Okay, so we're really starting here with a very broad overview of ballot initiatives. So if you're thinking about this for the first time, it just gives you some general background on the different types available and the process. So what do we know about ballot initiatives? We know that they are broadly available. So only 26 states have statewide processes, but 48 have at least one city that allows citywide initiatives. And most states either require or allow their jurisdictions or certain jurisdictions to partake in this process. We also know that there are 3 general types of ballot initiatives that may be available to you. You may have one of these, you may have all of them. You'll really have to take a close look at your laws to see what's available. But the thing to know here is mainly that there are pros and cons to each type. And the 3 types are direct initiated ordinances, indirect initiated ordinances, and initiated charter amendments. And indirect ordinances, the difference is that they actually proceed to the legislative body before a ballot. So after a finding that enough signatures are collected to qualify the initiated ordinance, the city council or county board of directors, or excuse me, board of commissioners has an opportunity to act on that initiative. Usually there's a certain period of time that they have to consider it. They can adopt it. They might be able to amend it at that point. They could reject it. They could do nothing, at which point it usually proceeds to the ballot for voters to consider. And charter amendments are unique in that there's an advantage to them because typically it's more difficult for the city council or county board of commissioners to amend that and tamper with it after voters have approved it, because charters, as I'm sure you know, usually require voter approval to be amended. The challenge with that route, of course, is that initiated charter amendments typically have a higher signature threshold. So just some things to consider when you're looking at the options available in your locale. Next slide, please. Okay, so we know that these are often available, but before proceeding, you'll have to do a very exciting legal analysis to figure out if it's feasible where you live. So of course, availability, looking at your local code, your charter, your state laws, or all of them to figure out which types you have. And then you want to consider whether there are any subject matter restrictions that could impact your ability to pursue the policy. You'll need to consider preemption, which I'm sure you're familiar with. Rent control, of course, is a common preempted area where the state says, you know, our municipalities or certain municipalities don't have the ability to do this. But sometimes there are exceptions to preemption that can be utilized, or even like creative ways around it. So the guide kind of goes into some examples where that's occurred. And finally, we have local municipal authority, which is a different question than preemption. It's about whether the state has granted permission to its jurisdictions to enact a certain type of policy. So in the right to counsel context, jurisdictions might draw from their police power or their authority to legislate for the general welfare in enacting the law. And this analysis might differ based on whether you're in a general law jurisdiction or a charter jurisdiction. Charter cities and counties typically feel like they have a little bit more leeway there because they're usually looking at whether the state has restricted them from acting rather than being concerned about identifying a specific grant of authority. And that's kind of a oversimplification. There's always gray areas, but just keep in mind that the answer to this question is often dependent on the kind of jurisdiction where you are. Next slide. Thank you. So, all right, you've confirmed that these 4 areas aren't an impediment. So you might be wondering what the process looks like. And so this handy flow chart just kind of visually depicts the differences between the indirect and direct processes and where they converge and where they diverge. So you'll see from drafting an application to the review process, collection of signatures, and then if enough signatures are valid, of course, the direct goes to the ballot and the indirect to the legislative body, as we discussed, where they'll have a variety of options. Again, very dependent on your jurisdiction. It's a little challenging to generalize, so we've got a bunch of fun notes and caveats in here. But if you're a visual learner, hopefully this can help you to anticipate what to expect. Okay.
Wonderful. All right, the next section of our guide is a bit of a monster. It is running a ballot initiative campaign, which, as you all know, involves many, many steps and many partners. So we start with a discussion of what, excuse me, what kinds of partner organizations to recruit, who to work with, kind of the factors that you want to analyze as you're putting together a campaign team, how to set expectations around working together through coalition agreements, and then power mapping to assess your landscape. And then, of course, we get into campaign structure and strategies, which is a really critical element of the day-to-day operations of a campaign. So once you know who's involved, you kind of assess who is involved at which levels, right? Not everyone can be focused 100% on the campaign. Sometimes you have unions who are focused on a strike and can't fully commit until that strike is over. Sometimes you have state level organizations who are really focused on the legislative session and can't be all in until session is over. So considering all those factors, you want to design a campaign that allows people to show up in the ways that they can, right? There's not a, well, if you can't do this, you can't be part of it. It's really designing different levels of engagement for folks so that they can throw in what they can in terms of effort. And then we have a helpful table of various campaign tactics and activities that can be carried out by various work groups. I'll preview that in a bit. And then a big piece of ballot initiative work that we did not want to overlook is campaign finance. So as this quote from one of our campaign partners tells us, campaign finance is critical to the livelihood of a campaign because the money that you spend on a campaign, there's going to be a magnifying glass on that from the public, but most importantly, the opposition. So making sure that every organization involved is being very clear about reporting, record keeping, any time that they spend on the campaign. All of that is really important to maintaining the financial sustainability of the campaign, but also kind of the nonprofit status of everyone involved. And so we have a section on that. And then, of course, we feature 2 case studies from our friends in Denver, Colorado, who ran the No Eviction Without Representation campaign, and then our friends in Multnomah County, Oregon, who are currently running a campaign for eviction representation for all. Next slide, please. And so this is an example, and don't feel like you have to read this right now. This is just pulled out from our guide. This is an example of a breakdown of some tasks and activities that different work groups can do. So for example, the way that you break down your campaign structure may look different, but this is an example of a campaign that has a decision-making or steering committee body, and then a comms team. And of course, there are other pieces, but I didn't want to cram the slide too much. So comms team, for example, there's a brainstorm of the potential members of a communications team. One of the important things I like to name is that don't limit your comms work to comms staff. There are incredible volunteers out there who are just natural born speakers and folks who can create conversations at dinner tables and at events that you also need to recruit for communication. So think really broadly about the types of expertise that you could have in your comms team. And then the activities, there's some comms activities that we've listed here. One of the most important ones I want to name is there is a difference between narrative strategy and communications plan, right? Communications is kind of spreading the word, and then narrative is really figuring out what the word is. So what is the story that you want to be telling? What are the values you want to be uplifting? What are the ways that you want to make people feel when they hear or see your campaign in the news and on the ballot? And then, of course, there's just a few other considerations that we added as you're putting together these teams. Next slide. The other sections of this Running a Ballot Initiative campaign chapter are facing the opposition, right? So of course, our campaigns are more so focused on mobilizing voters, mobilizing people who are in support or undecided. But we of course have to have a bit of an analysis of who our opposition is. So we have a section on identifying who they are, tracking the opposition and their money, and we have some helpful tools in there for you to do a bit of power mapping on who your local opposition is when you are running housing campaigns. And then in that section, we also have two really powerful case studies from Pasadena, California, and Portland, Maine, both cities that successfully passed rent control. And Pasadena also passed just cause protections just recently in the November 2022 election. And then we have the pleasure of Jack and Anna, who have joined us from Portland, Maine, to talk more about their campaign as well. Next slide. And then our next chapter is focused on building a housing justice narrative. So like I mentioned earlier, narrative is really key to campaigns, and the ways that we communicate about what our vision is through a ballot initiative is key to moving voters. So I want to just make it really clear that when we are talking about campaigns and who we speak to, there's kind of a breakdown statistically based on a lot of polling that shows where voters are, right? This is where our electorate is in terms of how they feel about the types of policies we're pushing. 23% of our base, right? Those are probably people who are here in this room, in the Zoom room right now. They're throwing down for these efforts. They believe in it. They deeply believe that we together can build a new housing future. There are 59% of people who are persuadables. They care about the issue, but are not really directly interacting with campaigns, right? They know that there's a housing crisis. They're unsure of the types of solutions, and they've been hearing a lot. And they very much are movable in that there are ways we can talk to them and engage with them that move them towards the base. And then there's the opposition, right? That represents about 18% of the electorate. Those are people who require deep canvassing. They will not be deeply aligned with our campaigns, and they most likely will vote no. And it's really important to name that we are not seeking to change the minds of the opposition when we run these campaigns, right? We have our base that we're mobilizing, and then we have our persuadables who we know in the numbers can help push our ballot initiatives towards victory over that 50%. So we have some housing justice narrative tools in there, as well as some additional resources for you all. And then next slide. And then, of course, we have the hangover, what happens after Election Day, whether you win or lose, whether you had a good or bad time, there's going to be a hangover. And so we have some tips on what to do and how to prepare your coalition after the campaign has officially ended after Election Day, right? A lot of those things consist of claiming the narrative, regrouping as a coalition and figuring out what has to happen next, dealing with potential litigation from the opposition. It's a very popular tactic of theirs, as well as ensuring that, if you were able to pass a policy, how you can ensure strong implementation and strong enforcement from your local governments. And then with those elements, we have two case studies that uplift the stories of St. Paul. Minnesota and Orange County, Florida, both jurisdictions that passed, that were voters approved rent stabilization. All right, next slide. And I'm going to kick it over to Jasmine to introduce our speakers.
Yeah, of course. Thank you both so much for giving us a preview. I'm really excited to dig into the guide a little bit deeper, even though we've been digging into it already. But I hope that you all are too. But I think it's time for us to take a step back and actually hear from organizers. So I am thrilled to introduce Jack and Anna, both Portland, Maine residents who are volunteers on several local ballot initiative campaigns in Portland. The first of which in 2017 helped cultivate not only a growing energy, understanding, and the support needed for eventual wins on a suite of policies in 2020, which fostered and inspired residents to pursue a vision for the city that embodied values of justice and equity that was simply not being brought forward by the local city council officials at the time. But in addition, their work also fostered wins that created a solid policy foundation for future housing justice wins that we saw in Portland in 2022. Thank you both so much for being here. I'd love to pass it on to Trom to also introduce Colleen.
Thank you. I'm excited to introduce Colleen because as some of you may know, I was born and raised in Portland, Oregon. So seeing housing justice being advanced in Multnomah County, which is where Portland is, makes me really proud. Colleen is one of the volunteers and leaders of the Eviction Representation for All campaign, which is a robust volunteer group that has successfully placed tenant right to counsel on the ballot in Multnomah County with the collection of tens of thousands of signatures. So really excited to have Colleen here, and I hope you're all excited to see her beautiful ERA sweatshirt, which yeah, I'm super excited for y'all to see that. Thanks for joining us, Colleen.
But first, I'll pass it over to Jack and Anna to give us a little bit of insight on how y'all won your campaigns. What were your biggest takeaways from running a ballot initiative campaign?
So I think what we're going to do is I'm going to just talk a little bit about like the broader structure of the campaign, and then I'm going to kick it over to Anna, who's going to talk about like some of our messaging, which I think was pivotal, and also something that evolved from 2017 to 2020 to 2022. So I'm just going to do a brief start to that. But first, let me say thank you for doing this. Thank you for doing this work. If we had had this policy guide in 2017, we would have been in a wildly different place. We were calling up like West Hollywood and Tacoma Park and being like, how did you do this? And like, you know, of course, that happened 30 years ago in those places. And so they gave us really good advice and they were extremely kind, but the work that you're doing would have made the work that we did so much easier, probably led to a lot less conflict amongst the campaign as we tried to figure things out. I think that when we started in 2017, the housing crisis was just getting going. And Portland, which is a small city just north of Boston, was experiencing a particularly bad housing crisis because it's victim to a certain amount of commuting work from both Boston and New York. And it's also a tourist city, so there's a certain number of Airbnbs that were coming in. When we started this conversation, you couldn't even say rent control. Like we had to only say the phrase rent stabilization because rent control was so far off the table. But what was really painful as residents of the city was that the city officials or the city council was largely very strongly backed or working in close concert with the real estate industry. And so what that meant is that all of the narratives coming out of City Hall were ultimately market rate solutions. And like, we can tweak this here, we can tweak this here, maybe we can do this little thing. But really speaking to the crisis and what was actually happening to people, that, you know, disabled, elderly, low-income folks, working class folks in the city were being kicked out for profit, and this was happening at scale, just wasn't being addressed. And there was something that when we came to the table and we said, we are going to run a rent control campaign, it was met with vociferous and like overwhelming critique from the real estate industry. But it was also one of those things that it did two things. One is that it put real policy solutions on the table. And I think that there was a lot of renters who were not politically activated at that point. Just hearing that people were talking about solutions that would really meaningfully have effect changed how they interacted with politics. And that was really important. The other thing was bringing out the real estate industry and making them fight in public. And making them fight in public and watching what they did to bury, like, I think we spent $7,000, right, in our first campaign, and they spent $120,000. And just one of the things that I think we did very well was we showed just how overwhelming this was. And I think a lot of the pieces that the PolicyLink folks have gotten together about disaster narratives and your finances under scrutiny, that's definitely the case, but you can also play that back at them. You can show everybody their finances, and then you can also take their hysterical narratives around disaster and then be like, oh, let's talk about that. And I would say we're about to have our 4th rent control referendum, and this one's actually backed by the landlords. And it is going to be a delight to take all of their disaster narratives and bring them back to the fore for Rent Control 4, because, oh, remember what you said in 2017? Here we are in 2023. So starting that conversation in 2017, it was really just a ragtag group of people who were like, let's do this. Maine and Portland both have long traditions of referenda. So this is something that was very consistent with the public's sort of tradition about how we engage with issues. It was a difficult fight. And I think one of the things that we should have gotten our heads around earlier was that the right thing to do was to think about this as a conversation and not winning on the first round. And so I think that would have actually helped us a lot to recognize that the point of the campaign, at least in the first pass, is to set up that conversation in a way that's going to be conducive to future conversations. We ultimately succeeded in 2020 in what I think is a pretty interesting approach. We, together with a bunch of other groups who had also done sort of anti-gentrification campaigns, a $15 an hour minimum wage, a views ordinance, zoning changes. There was a coalescence in 2020 where we were going to run 5 simultaneous referenda: a facial surveillance ban, rent control, an inclusionary zoning, a ban on Airbnbs, and a $15 an hour minimum wage. And what that did was it did 2 things. It allowed us to have a conversation about our broader vision for the city, not just about this specific tactical fight, because our local, Portland is a very democratic city. It's one of the most left-leaning places in the United States. And so the Chamber of Commerce had gotten very good at concern trolling, right? Oh, we agree with what you're saying. We agree that housing is in crisis, but you're doing it wrong. And so they would just rich-splain us how to do democracy. And then it was painful to watch. By doing 5 referenda all at once, we created a context in which they could no longer do that. And we had to have a broader conversation about what is the society that we imagine. And that they were not prepared for. And then sort of putting wages together with housing, together with commodification, together with police surveillance powers, really, and then of course, in the context of 2020, it really made for a powerful moment. I would also say that, like, the Airbnb, particularly having that conversation together with rent control and talking about the commodification of housing and who profits from it, that was a really important back and forth. So, you know, while it's a big lift for anybody to run a referendum, I think Anna and I would both really agree with that, having been through this a couple of times. Putting them together as interlocking pieces, it can often be even more powerful. And I'll be really interested to hear about the other comrades who are going to speak about the aftermath, because one of the bits of advice we got from West Hollywood was that once you get it over the line, you're only halfway there. That was definitely our experience. There was a bunch of tenant organizing. There was a bunch of real losses. We had some real struggles with the city. So I'm now going to turn out to Anna, who was one of our doyens on the media side and talking about our communications.
Sure. So overall, I think that the campaign went forward as People First Portland, as opposed to Business or Profit First Portland. And we certainly had some key questions about messaging. You know, how do you really harness this shared sense that our communities are dissolving by high rents and gentrification? And then what can you say to break this really deeply ingrained idea that housing is a commodity? It's just supply and demand, and that's just how things are. So as we prepared to collect our signatures, We also recognized it was a really critical moment. COVID was suddenly raging. A series of really enormous BLM marches and rallies were happening. So you could really see this kind of collective paradigm shift beginning to happen. And so what we considered in that was really driving that collective sense of this really heart-centered and accessible messaging that everybody can and should get behind. So we had messages like protect the city that we love, homes, not hotels, was maybe the kind of flattest message that we had, but also love thy neighbor, stop gentrification, or keep Portland alight in the darkness. And since we have famous lighthouses, we were able to use the one that's in one of our neighborhoods on our messaging. But ultimately, also our local BLM chapter had made many demands of the city to better support renters and people experiencing homelessness. So a lot of our messaging was also to try to bolster what they were trying to move forward in our city. And we tried to uplift their voices while also explaining, what the intersections are between race and class and housing justice and what that means on the local level. So one of our most popular items was, or kind of Instagram post was, a $15 minimum wage would benefit about 42% of Black workers in Portland, and drawing similar correlations just across the board for what that means for our communities of color or for people who don't currently have homes. So finally, just on the messaging and campaign front, we just tried to leverage, again, these really heart-centered messaging plus a lot of crowdsourcing by training people up. So we had many volunteers who pitched in to respond to the Facebook and Instagram like paid advertisements by the opposition, and we coined them the Troll Patrol so that they could quickly jump on and pull apart some of the insidious narratives that the opposition had. So on a whole, again, just trying to point to how we need to come together. And this isn't just about profits. This is about deeply caring for humans. And I think that really helped push us along. So I know we're already over time. I'll pass it on.
Yeah, thank you both so much for that insight. I'd love to invite Colleen now to share a little bit more about the eviction representation for all campaign.
Sure. Thanks, y'all. Yeah, a lot of the things that I wanted to say have been said. I think I came to this conversation really hoping to talk about the way that this work is part of movement work and part of organizing. I think the first question that was asked to me from the panel was, how would this have helped this guide? And I think I agree with one of the former previous speakers to say, part of what we are doing every time we do a ballot initiative or something like this is we are leaving evidence, right? That should be in our minds from the start. We are leaving evidence for future organizers and for concurrent organizers. But that evidence is hard to find, right? Our group did probably 6 months of political education work at the very beginning of this campaign. That's where we started, we collected evidence, and a guide like this would have been really helpful, I think, in helping us to do that. And so I'm really, really grateful that this exists. I think. This idea of leaving evidence, I don't want to say that it's the primary goal, but if you can hold in your hearts and in your minds multiple timelines for your campaigns, right? There is a timeline of the campaign, and I think that that's incredibly useful. It has a start and it has an end. It will end, as opposed to some of the other movement work that I think lots of us are involved in, which is ongoing, and we come in and out of that. This has an end, and it changes strategy, it changes tactics to know that there's an end point. And so keeping that matters, right? You're doing one big structure test, right, of what's possible today under the conditions where you are. But then the second timeline to keep in mind is I've been really, really inspired by some recent work out of the 1 Million Experiments Project, which is a project of Miriam Kaba's and connected to Interrupting Criminalization. And they talk about organizing on a 500-year time clock. And I find that incredibly useful when I think about the role of ballot initiatives, because these are multi-year campaigns. Whether you win it the first time, whether you lose it the first time and you don't go back to it, I think it's really inspiring to hear from lots of organizers who have done 2 and 3 versions of this, right? But no matter which way it goes, you're a part of organizing on this 500-year time clock. It has taken, without going into the weeds or not, into the theory, right? It's taken 500 years to develop the housing system we have under capitalism in the United States, right? This is not natural. It was developed. It was fought hard. They fought hard to get it here. Lots of people have fought back the whole time. And we are now contributing to that 500-year timeline, and building success along the way. And so keeping these multiple timelines, I think, is really helpful. Time becomes very funny. I woke up this morning and on one, in my, I'm a mom, I work, I have a job, I know that I only have 8 weeks left of this phase of the campaign. Our vote is in May 16th. And I'm like, 8 weeks. Oh, as a mom and as somebody who buys groceries and does all that stuff, I'm like, 8 weeks. That's great. We're almost done. And then in my campaign brain, I'm like, we have eras of time, right? It's expansive what's left, what's possible in 8 weeks. And that's really, really exciting. So keeping these 2 timelines in mind. Yeah, I'm going to just go through my points really quickly about the delight of organizing a ballot measure as a part of movement work. Yeah, I think by taking it to the ballot, I know that I think it was Amanda wanted to ask me. So in our case, so the way that it works here is we wrote the law, right? We did that 6 months of political education work. We wrote the law. We worked with a legal team. We brought in a legal team to vet it and defend it, but not to write it. And then that we submitted to the county, and we knew that we were going to be challenged. There's the Portland Business Alliance in Multnomah County. We knew that they would challenge it, and this is one of the things to get ready for. And I think we put this in the ballot measure, which is expect opposition and then use it, right? What do you learn every time they have to step out of the shadows? And we learned a lot, right? We just in that legal that legal challenge of the language of the measure. Anyway, we won the legal challenge. You learn a bunch about the process there. And then we go to signature gathering. That's a huge organizing opportunity. I think lots of people have probably talked about that in lots of ways. And then it goes to the county commissioner, right? So we had enough signatures. And then the commissioners have the option to either push it to to just pass it, or to refer it to the ballot for voters. And I think that that's an opportunity if you feel like you could really apply pressure at that time to get it passed right away in your community. I think that's a worthwhile intervention. But I also think that it's important to remember that don't really put your hopes or dreams there, because you're cutting hundreds of thousands of people out of the process. The benefit of doing this through a ballot measure is you are inviting in everybody, right? Everybody who votes in your community, you're inviting them to take a position, but you're also inviting everybody, voter, or non-voter, to have a position, to have these conversations, to read the news, right? So you are building mass movement through making it, right? Making it a public issue. I want to reiterate what somebody said, but the other thing we do is we force the opposition to abandon bad faith arguments. They have to say something, right? And so things we're hearing is oh, we love this policy, we could do this. And then we're just but have you? Right? And you can just sit there and I'll wait, and so they have to abandon things that have been working for them. And so again, on that 500-year timeline, or even 100 years, 50 years, you're forcing them to get rid of things that have been working for them. And that is unbelievably useful. Expose the power structures and alliances that are strengthened through secrecy. These power structures exist, expose them. It will suck. It will feel bad. The other thing is do the work of relationship building within your coalition so that nobody takes it personally, right? Don't set up one person to be the person who's gonna look like they misstepped or didn't understand something. Take responsibility together. It's a really, really powerful practice. Yeah, and then the other benefit of doing this, you're going to be at this for a couple of years, and I guarantee you will develop and refine and practice new skills. It is unbelievably useful how much we have learned. It is not the primary purpose, but hundreds and hundreds of people are more skilled by doing this work, and that's invaluable. Build work that can be shared. Don't set up your campaign to rely on anybody being the sole holder of anything. Share work, build relationships internally and across the coalition. And then another skill that I think is really important is that you will learn to discern when to de-escalate, when to escalate, and how to prioritize. And that's going to be internally, right? And it's also going to be externally. There are times when it is really strategic to de-escalate, and it will feel bad. You're like, but we really want to get into this fight today. And you have to have that discernment skill. And also saying, just because we de-escalated tomorrow doesn't mean that we will do that always. We will also at other times escalate and go hard. Somebody from Pasadena, I think is quoted in the piece about how underestimated you will be, and use that to your benefit. So yeah, the skills of de-escalating, escalating, and prioritizing are things that you'll walk away better and more skilled at. And when I say you, I'm talking about hundreds of people who care about housing justice. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So much wisdom being shared. So many nods, just echoing how people have experienced these things, and naming them is critically important, right? The learning that we gain through running these campaigns it's unmatched. So even, obviously this guide is meant to help people through it, but as people run campaigns, add to that collection of knowledge and continue sharing it. I want to transition really quick. We have a couple of minutes for Q&A. Appreciate Jack answering some questions in the Q&A section of the chat. And also, if anyone else in the audience has a question for one of our speakers or for us as authors of the guide, please feel free to put that in the chat. Yes, the recording will be shared. We'll send out an email to everyone who is registered later this week with slides, a recording, and the link to the guide. I'm going to be selfish and take a minute for, we do have a question. Oh, yes. Any advice for sustaining strong coalitions? I will say one thing, and then I'll open it up to our speakers. I would say set up your expectations early on and know when you're entering into a long-term, more generative relationship or a short-term transactional relationship, right? Obviously, movement spaces are more conducive to long-term relationships, but oftentimes you have 9 months to run a campaign. It's okay to have a transactional relationship with someone if you know when it ends, where it begins, and the factors, the considerations that surround it. So I would say that, and then I'll open it up to our speakers for sharing other intel. Okay, we're playing mute chicken. We also have a section in our guide about coalition agreements, which I think is also really important for long-term accountability. So developing a set of agreements, and these, if, for example, if you've worked with organizations before and you know that some tension exists because it's organizing and that happens, right? Make sure you're kind of getting ahead of some of that in terms of like putting agreements into the document about, how you approach certain issues, and then always be ready for accountability conversations, and be okay in accepting of tension, because that will just make us stronger, right? Conflict, tension, these are all good things that help us grow as organizers. So never run away from it, because hiding it is just going to create a bigger problem later. It's okay to have arguments within coalitions. That's just a part of, it's like being a sibling, right? That's just a part of it. Oh, perfect. We have a question about conflict resolution. So we have a few resources actually in our guide on how to do that. But I also see Colleen's hand, so I'm going to pass it over to her.
Yeah, I think that there's some great conflict resolution guides out there. One thing that I think has helped our coalition a lot is we don't use the phrase, well, we'll just. Right. I think there's, well, like comms, if you could just, or like, hey, field, all you got to do is just like get out. Right. It's like, what that does is says to somebody else's work that it's easy, it's fast, it's, not meaningful, but that maybe you don't see the amount of work that it goes into it. And so in addition to lifting up and celebrating everything, right, where our Slack is very full of the celebrations of work done, we also strive to not to show each other and each other individually and also organizationally that when we ask something of somebody, we understand the full thing that we're asking, right? And we know how we can be supportive. There are things that only one coalition member or organization is able to do, right? So you can't, it's not a thing of like, we can all do all of the things and then nobody does anything, right? Like some work has to get done either within a committee or within a certain organization. And it, like, how we talk to each other about the work, right? I think this goes back to, right, like whose work is valued and what work is visible and invisible in what ways, but really value each other's time. End meetings early, for the love of God. Like, yeah, if you can end a meeting early, do that. Take that 10 minutes, right? Find those ways, because the purpose is not to avoid conflict. And I think Tom, your point's really well taken, that when conflict arises, like come in together and work that out, whatever it is, and de-escalate and escalating. The difference between how we conflict mediate within coalition and how we address conflict outside, right? Like how we're all oppositionally focused. We're like, we're fight. And you have to know when to say, we are not fighting, we're in conflict. And those are different things and they're different skills. And also don't expect that everybody comes to the coalition knowing how to do those. Find ways to practice them, right? It would be lovely if we were all raised with the like deep conflict mediation skills we need to survive in this world, but we don't. So don't expect people to know how to do them and say like, oh, if you don't know how to do this, like make it possible to practice small, practice under low stakes. So when that really big, important conflict comes up, you are more skilled at internal conflict than you were at the beginning. Value each other's labor, talk to each other sincerely. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Colleen. Well, we are at time. I appreciate everyone engaging in the chat, answering and asking questions. I'll say again, thank you so much to our speakers for sharing their time and expertise, and feel free to, if you're interested in connecting with them, please let us know and we're happy to. I would say maybe for Colleen after May, given all that's happening. But I know that Jack and Anna have been incredibly generous with their time and are really excited to connect with folks who are running campaigns. So do get in touch with us. And of course, share this report with everyone who is thinking of running a campaign. It's an invaluable tool. We'll build on that knowledge together as a collective. So when you do run campaigns, let us know how we can support and how we can contribute to the movements that you're building in your localities. And lastly, we will be following up with an email that has all of these tools, but also our post-webinar survey. So if you can right now, please feel free to take that survey. Let us know what's helpful, what's not, so that we can do this again in the future. And yeah, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate you all being here, making the time for this important work. And we'll look forward to seeing you all on the ballot in November and sooner in May.